There's no universe where Dexter Morgan and James Doakes end up best friends. Oil and water, a shark and the lifeguard. The very idea feels absurd. Their personalities, their morals, their methods, everything about them is at odds. Dexter, a methodical and calculated killer hiding in plain sight, and Doakes, a no-nonsense detective determined to uncover Dexter's dark secret, both living in constant conflict. But let's throw logic out the window for a second and dive into a world where the impossible happens. Dexter kills his brother. Life, for lack of a better word, resumes. There's blood on his hands, but it washes off. Routine is his sanctuary. Work, donuts, pretending to care about coworkers' weekend plans, even bowling with Masuka and Batista. But no matter where he turns, there's always that presence looming behind him, a shadow, watching, waiting. Doakes. The man has been glued to Dexter like a cop on a suspect who just can't slip up. And Dexter? He can't so much as breathe without Doakes analyzing his oxygen intake. Bathroom trips? Supervised. Late night drives? Forget about it. Even his apartment, his one place of solace, isn't safe. Deborah practically moved in after recent events, leaving Dexter with zero privacy. He doesn't blame her. But Doakes? Doakes is another level of invasive. Morning. Ritual time. Donuts. Dexter walks in, places the box on the desk. He doesn't even look at Doakes. He knows. Still, he offers. Doakes scoffs. I'd trust those donuts as far as I can throw you, and that ain't far enough. Dexter thinks, arsehole. But somewhere, deep down in that reptilian part of his brain, there's something resembling appreciation. Doakes knows. Maybe not everything, but killers recognize killers. And yet, breakfast must wait. There's a body on the beach. A homeless man. Stab wound. Nothing fancy. Standard homicide. Next to him, a crying dog. Masuka, of all people, is comforting it. I didn't know you liked dogs, Dexter muses. I don't, Masuka replies, scratching the dog's ear. He just reminds me of Butch. Butch? My neighbor's Rottweiler back in high school. Vicious thing. Anytime you walked past, you had to run. Run? It got tiring in my own damn house. Dexter tilts his head. What did you do? Masuka smirks. Started feeding him meat from the fridge. Gave him something he wanted, and he left me alone. Something clicks in Dexter's mind. A connection forming like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Then, his father appears. The ever-present ghost of Harry Morgan, standing just out of reach. Voice as grave as ever. Bad idea, Dex. I know what you're thinking. Dexter's jaw tightens. He's never going to leave me alone. And this is no way to live. If you're enjoying the twists and turns of this story, we've got a lot more in store. And trust us, you don't want to miss it. Plus, we want to hear from you. Do you think Doakes' time on the show ended too soon? Was his character just getting started? Or did his unpredictable nature make his departure a shocking and necessary move for the plot? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Dexter sat at the dinner table with his family, absently pushing food around his plate. He wasn't particularly hungry. He had bowling later, but that wasn't the real reason for his lack of appetite. The absence of killing gnawed at him like an addict deprived of a fix. He felt jittery, his skin too tight, his mind restless. The dark passenger inside him stirred impatiently. Rita, oblivious to his turmoil, chatted about bowling, trying to engage him. Normally, he could fake his way through the small talk, but his mind was elsewhere, on Doakes. The last thing he wanted was to open that Pandora box with Rita. She might not be as sharp as Doakes, but even she could start connecting dots if he wasn't careful. One problem at a time, he reminded himself. And then, just as he was steering the conversation towards safer territory, Rita blindsided him. You know, I saw Doakes outside the house the other day. Dexter froze. The fork in his hand felt heavier, almost foreign. His mind racing, cycling through possibilities. Damage control, contingencies. He forced a smile, feigning mild curiosity. Oh? What was he doing? Rita shrugged, sipping her wine. I don't know. Just sitting in his car. Watching, maybe? She laughed, lightly, as if the idea of Dexter being surveilled was absurd. I waved, but he didn't wave back. He looked intense. That was an understatement. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. His mind was elsewhere, calculating, analyzing, planning. Rita talked, Asta and Cody laughed, but Dexter was miles away, already crafting his next move. Dexter was driving through the night, his car cutting through the streets of Miami. The city was alive, but Dexter was lost in his thoughts. He hadn't planned on being out for long, but when he glanced in his rearview mirror, a familiar car tailed him. It was Doakes. Dexter's heartbeat quickened as he tried to process the situation. Dexter had been planning a fresh kill to blow off some steam, but with Doakes following him, that plan was no longer viable. He quickly made a sharp turn and drove in the opposite direction. He could feel Doakes following him closely, ever persistent, never giving up on his hunch that something wasn't right with Dexter. As Dexter turned into a quiet neighborhood, he knew exactly where he was going. His childhood home. The house where Brian Moser, his estranged brother, had once held Deborah hostage. Dexter didn't need to step inside the house to know the ghosts that lingered there. He had never been able to shake the memories of that place. The trauma had shaped him into the person he was today. It was a painful reminder of everything he had endured, and he wasn't sure he wanted to face it tonight. But as Dexter parked in front of the house, he saw Doakes' car pull up behind him. Dexter could almost hear the detective's thoughts as he got out of his vehicle, confusion and suspicion swirling in his mind. Doakes wasn't one to back off easily, and Dexter knew that tonight there would be no avoiding the confrontation that had been brewing for so long. Doakes stepped forward, his voice laced with suspicion. "Okay, you sick motherfucker. What's your angle here?" Dexter stands before Doakes, choosing his words carefully. The tension between them feels thick in the air, but Dexter knows he can't afford to give too much away. The time has come for him to reveal just enough of the truth to explain his odd behavior, but not enough to expose who he really is. He needs to throw Doakes off his trail, without admitting to anything that could tie him to the killings. "Listen," Dexter says, his voice low. "There's something you need to understand. Something that's not easy to explain." Doakes narrows his eyes, not sure what to make of it. "What the hell are you talking about, Dexter?" Dexter swallows, taking a deep breath. He can feel the weight of the memory, the rawness of it, but he can't back out now. Not when he's already gone this far. "When I was a kid, my mother was murdered. They found her in a van, chainsawed to death. Left there with me and Brian for what felt like months," Dexter says, his voice steady but his eyes distant as he recalls the moment. "I didn't know it at the time, but it broke him. It twisted him. Brian became a killer, just like the guy who murdered her. He wanted to hurt people, wanted to make them suffer." Doakes stood there, stunned, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "Jesus fucking Christ. Brian Moser was your brother? What the fuck?" The shock was evident in his voice, but there was something else in his eyes now. Understanding. Dexter's gaze drops to the floor briefly, before meeting Doakes' eyes again. "But me? I didn't become a killer. I just became obsessed with blood, with understanding it. The blood, the violence. It didn't break me the way it broke Brian. It made me want to study it. I became a blood spatter expert. That's where my mind went." Dexter pauses, hoping the weight of his words has the desired effect. He knows Doakes won't understand completely, but maybe, just maybe, this will make him stop digging. "I'm just odd, Doakes," Dexter adds quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I can't explain it better than that." For a moment, there's a silence between them. Doakes watches him, his eyes piercing, trying to make sense of what Dexter has said. Dexter feels exposed, but he can't backtrack now. Not when this half-truth might just be enough to throw Doakes off his trail. Dexter continued, his tone somber. "I only found out about Brian not too long ago. When he took Deborah, it was a shock to my system. But he was there that day, in the van with me. That was the moment that changed everything for both of us. He became a killer, and I became what I am now." Dexter looked at Doakes, his eyes cold but not without emotion. "So now you know. Do with it what you will, but leave me the fuck alone." Without another word, Dexter turned and walked away, leaving Doakes standing in the darkness, processing everything he had just heard. Doakes had always suspected that Dexter was hiding something, but this revelation, this raw honesty, was more than he had bargained for. Later, alone in the car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. His conversation with Doakes had been a gamble, a well-played poker bluff. But even the best bluffs carried risk, and he just pushed Doakes deeper into his suspicions, giving him more reason to dig. Doakes was smart, no doubt about it. A veteran of war, a detective shaped by years of intense military discipline, and the problem with men like Doakes was that once they latched onto a gut feeling, they didn't let go. They chased it, pursued it, until they had answers. Dexter had played his hand, but the ball was in Doakes' court now, and that was what worried him the most. Hours later, Dexter was back at his apartment, preparing a meal. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. Relief? Guilt? Or something else entirely. The steak sizzled on the grill, the comforting sound of cooking filling the silence of the room. But just as he was starting to lose himself in the rhythm of the mundane, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Deborah, letting him know she'd be stuck at the station, buried under paperwork courtesy of LaGuerta. Dexter sighed, knowing he'd be alone for the night. Then, a knock at the door. Dexter opened it to find Doakes standing there, holding a six-pack of Bohemian beer. The detective's face was unreadable, but there was a certain wariness in his eyes. He didn't say anything at first. He just held up the beer, offering it as a silent truce. "I bought beer," Doakes said, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. Dexter didn't know what to say. After everything that had happened, after the truth had been laid bare between them, he wasn't sure what came next. But as he opened a bottle of beer, there was a sense of unspoken understanding between them. For the first time, they weren't enemies. They weren't chasing each other through the shadows. They were just two men trying to make sense of their broken lives. "Listen, Dex," Doakes said, his voice more subdued than usual. "What you told me, that was pretty fucked up. I'm sorry for tailing you. I don't know what I'm going to do with this information yet, but I get it." Dexter took a sip of his beer, his mind still racing with the rawness of the conversation. As Doakes turned to leave, Dexter stopped him. "If you're hungry, I've got steak. I was going to throw it away, but..." Doakes hesitated for a moment. "Guess I'll stick around then." The two of them sat down at the table, eating steak and sharing beers. The awkwardness was still there, lingering in the air, but it was different now. They weren't enemies. They weren't suspicious of each other. For the first time, they were just two men who had both seen the worst in life and were trying to find a way to move forward. "So seriously?" Doakes asked, breaking the silence. "That's why you don't feel anything? Have you ever tried therapy?" Dexter took another swig of his beer before responding. "I've tried everything, but it doesn't work. My job gives me what I need." "So, are you going to tell LaGuerta?" Doakes chuckled darkly. "Had I known you had a past like this, I wouldn't have wanted to know, but I get it now. I won't say anything." The two men sat there for a while, each lost in their thoughts, the weight of the evening hanging over them. But as they finished their beers and the steaks were nothing more than scraps, Dexter realized something. Doakes, the man who had once been his greatest adversary, was no longer a threat. He wasn't just a detective chasing shadows. He was a man who, in his own way, understood the darkness that Dexter had carried with him for so long. Doakes said as he stood to leave, "I'll leave you to it. I'll see you at work." Dexter nodded. Doakes smiled, a genuine, rare smile. The next morning, Dexter walked into the office, the same routine as always. Donuts in hand, he tried to maintain his composure. Despite the one-on-one he had with Doakes the day before, the anxiety still clung to him. People can change their minds, and that lingering uncertainty had him on edge. One by one, his coworkers grabbed their donuts, each offering a quick nod in his direction as he plastered on his usual fake grin. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Then, out of nowhere, a surprising face appeared Doakes. He reached out and grabbed a donut, completely throwing Dexter off balance. As Doakes walked out, Dexter leaned back, a strange peace settling over him. The constant edge he usually carried seemed to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar. Maybe it was possible, after all, for two broken people to find a way to understand each other. Maybe there was room for friendship in this messed up world. The idea hung in the air, a fleeting thought he couldn't fully shake. Dexter allowed himself to sit with it, uncertain, but strangely hopeful. So, what do you think? Could there be a universe where Dexter and Doakes could bond over their shared experiences? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.